Chuck, it's good to see you. I gather it's coming on 7 o'clock in the evening in Israel where you are. We'll let our room populate for a few seconds here, um, and allow our audience to settle in and get started momentarily.
Sounds good.
I really appreciate your doing this essay. It's distinctive and important, and it was a fantastic addition to our resilience issue. Why don't we get started? Many people who join our Zoom calls are familiar with how we typically proceed, Chuck, but the way this works is you and I will chat about your essay in SAPIR for about 40 minutes, and then we open it up to audience questions. And so those of you listening in to this conversation, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A tab. So as Chuck Freilich says things that spark your curiosity, spark a question, put your question in the Q&A, and I will try to get to it. Typically, there are more questions than than we have time for. I'll ask. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions. We have smart people who contribute to SAPIR, and they can handle questions that aren't softballs. So I'll favor the harder questions. Chuck Freilich, you were a Deputy National Security Advisor. You're a senior fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. You're speaking to us from Israel. You just wrote a book on Israel and the cyber threat. And for our latest issue, which is, as you can see here, the resilience issue of SAPIR, our 13th volume, you wrote a really luminous and I think very important essay, Can Israel's Intelligence Services Be Saved? And the question could hardly be more pressing. Up until just a few years ago, I think many of us on this call sort of regarded Israel's intelligence services almost like the nearest approximation that humanity had to supermen. Your essay, Chuck, begins, of course, with a brief capsule summary of the extraordinary heist in Tehran in 2018 of the largest catch of human intelligence, I think, ever stolen from an enemy's capital. The nuclear dossiers and disks that Iran possessed, proving the extent of their nuclear program. A couple of years after that, the head of Iran's nuclear programs, Mr. Fakhrizadeh, met an untimely end on a road in what, by all appearances, was a very sophisticated Mossad operation. And just 3 years later, the greatest intelligence failure, the greatest security failure, the greatest political failure in all of Israel's history, which was, of course, October 7th of 2023. So let's begin there on October 7th. You register a variety of points about how something like this could have happened. And it's not simply one thing, as you point out, Chuck. I mean, a lot of people right after October 7th said, once again, Israel had a concepcia and the concepcia failed, but it was many factors. So walk us through what those factors were.
Well, first of all, let me just say thanks for having me and for hosting the piece in SAPIR. I'm a long-term fan of yours, as one of the last voices of sanity and reason in American public discourse. So it's a pleasure to be here. Before I get into the failures, let me just say that to a certain extent, the system worked. I'll give you two examples. First of all, a very low-level analyst, a master sergeant in Unit 8,200 wrote a number of counter assessments. In other words, she was saying that she expected something to happen, something significant. And not only did she reach the head of Unit 8,200, which is the Israeli equivalent of the American National Security Administration, in other words, the primary SIGINT and signals intelligence and cyber intelligence collection agency. In the US, it's something like 40,000 people. In Israel, it's something like 10,000 people. Not only did she reach the head of this unit, but she actually reached the head of military intelligence, a major general. So in terms of openness, there was some. It was unfortunately rejected. A second example is actually 8,200 got its hands on the entire Hamas attack plan at least a year before it happened. And somehow it got disregarded and dismissed by some of the higher-ups, and the real higher-ups never even saw it. So that, of course, was a colossal failure. But in terms of intelligence collection, it was a phenomenal success. And before we write off Israel's intelligence community, and there are no supermen there, and I think we've long been disabused of some of the notions that maybe people had about Israel in the post-67 era. We're not supermen, we're not capable of doing everything. And at the same time, we still do have what is one of the world's absolutely best intelligence establishments. And it is viewed so by the American intelligence community and other leading ones around the world. But not to put too fine a touch to it, we screwed up royally. It doesn't get worse. And the question is, how did this happen? And I think that October 7th, like all great intelligence failures, all great strategic surprises, was first and foremost a failure of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Hamas can't do this. They don't have the capability, so they won't. And contrary information is dismissed. We all know about cognitive dissonance and human cognition, how we process information. Information which is too divergent and too contrary to what we believe, we tend to downplay. Look at what happened to the US in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese can't win a war, so they won't attack. What happened to the Russians in Barbarossa, the surprise German attack in 41? Well, they just signed a non-aggression pact with us. They're not going to attack us. What happened to Israel in 73? Egypt can't win a war without air superiority, so they won't. Well, that wasn't the objective. They weren't trying to win a war. They were just trying to get some things going, and that they succeeded in. Getting a diplomatic process going as a result of the fighting. What happened to the US in 9/11? Who's getting bloody flight airplane, commercial airliners into skyscrapers? So it's a failure of imagination, and that's probably the biggest problem. And that relates to directly to what you're talking about is the so-called conceptia, the conception or the preconception. Intelligence agencies, much like each and every one of us as individuals, have to have a set of assumptions on the basis of which they function. Imagine if what they had to do every time an intelligence report comes in, and there are thousands, tens of thousands, or in today's world, maybe it's hundreds of thousands of reports every day of various types and shades. Some are very short, some are very long, some are from open sources, some from the most sensitive sources. Imagine if every time a report came in, for example, on Syria. What is Syria? Where is it? What's the nature of this country? What are its military capabilities? Who are its president? Who's its president? What kind of guy is Bashar Assad? What's the history of their civil war, their past wars with Israel, their relations with the United? You can't do that. So you build various working assumptions about how Syria, or in the case of what we're talking about, Hamas, how they function. And
can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
Because the idea of failure of imagination is not a new one. I mean, I remember reading the 9/11 report, which talks at length about failure of imagination. Israelis have been speaking for years about the imaginative failure to understand that Sadat might have goals that could be achievable short of a total victory, that he was different from Nasser. And in fact, intelligence organizations, as far as I know, all of them have sort of Team B exercises to test the reigning assumptions. They do this almost as a matter of course. It's good management at any intelligence agency. So why did nothing like that, or perhaps something like that did happen, and it didn't reach the level of being actionable?
So after the Yom Kippur War, I personally think that it's an even greater failure than October 7th, because the nation's very existence was in danger at the time. That wasn't the case here. The difference was that it was right on the border, people slaughtered in their homes. So emotionally, maybe the impact was a little harder. But after the Yom Kippur War, first of all, intelligence assessment divisions were established both in the Mossad and the Shin Bet, in addition to the longstanding one in military intelligence, which was until then, and to this day for that matter, the primary intelligence service in Israel, the biggest. That was one thing, because the idea was to encourage assessment pluralism, to have more than one assessment at any given time, at least about important issues. And the other thing that was done is exactly what you're alluding to, red teaming. And a red team was established in the Intelligence Division of Military Intelligence. Now, there are two problems with that. One is that when someone's function is known by everybody around them to be the contrarian, then after time, they start poo-pooing the assessments. And you have to be able to make an extraordinarily good case to get around that, because here maybe you've got one expert on the field versus the entire assessment team responsible for that field. Why should you doubt what, to make up a figure, the 10 or 15 people are saying when you're one person working on 10 different fields?
Mm-hmm.
And so red teams tend to get at least partly poo-pooed over time. And the other reason is that in Israel's case, so-called personnel slots are so coveted, they're so costly, that the higher-ups in Intel always have a incentive to steal some of them from the red team and move them back to the regular assessment division. And the red team had been basically gutted in military intelligence before that.
One of the points that you raise in your piece, which I thought was both obvious and underappreciated, is that no matter how much intel you have, few countries, even the United States, given the scale of the threats we face here, will ever have the resources to cover every conceivable eventuality. And in Israel's case, one of the points that you make is that, Israeli security officials are dealing with everything from the possibility of quasi-random stabbing attacks in the streets of Jerusalem to cyber threats coming from Russia or other actors, to Iranian drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, and then Hamas. And so the question then becomes for any Israeli political leader, well, how do you match the threat horizon to resource allocation that's realistic at any one time? And I ask this question, or I raise this point with this question, whether that is essentially an exculpatory factor for the Netanyahu government in terms of its performance on the eve of October 7th.
Well, if you can't handle the job, maybe you shouldn't be there. And Netanyahu is no different from any of his predecessors. And you get judged on the basis of your successes and your failures. there is an extraordinary problem here. Israel's a tiny country, but being prime minister of Israel may be the toughest job on earth. The pressure of critical, in some cases, absolutely historic decisions, the kind that most countries face once a decade or probably more like once a generation, in Israel are almost daily. They're very fun. Netanyahu was criticized because he allowed himself to spend the weekend in the US now to be out of Israel as prime minister for a day or two. And the entire situation really can change. The entire defense establishment, the intelligence establishment, are grossly overextended. Too few people forced to deal with too many issues. And by the way, Israel's defense establishment is not small, even in per capita terms, but the overall press of the issues is phenomenal. I think one of the problems that Israel faces is simply that the defense establishment faces is simply exhaustion. And people, I remember this from my own experience, by the time you begin to understand one issue and one crisis, 10 more have developed. In most countries, people have some time to learn what's happening. And I remember also speaking once, I won't get into specifics here, but to an Israeli intelligence official who was responsible for an important threat. And she was one person on this entire array of issues. And she told me that she faced, let's say, a half a dozen or 8 issues. And she said in the CIA, there's a person or two for each of them, even though for the US, it's a minor issue. So, yeah, you have to give people a little bit of credit for that. But again, if you can't, take the heat.
So I'd like to talk about Netanyahu in a little bit, but I want to stick to the question of Israeli resources and whether the intelligence problems that it faces could be alleviated if either you were to devote more resources to it or reorganize the bureaucracies. At least in the United States, my perception is that throwing money at problems does not necessarily improve the quality of intelligence analysis or assessment. And some of the large bureaucratic changes that took place in the wake of 9/11 simply added layers of bureaucracy that tended to cloud the intelligence picture rather than clarify it. So would similar sorts of moves actually help Israelis do a better job at not having moments like that staff sergeant reporting this threat perception and it going nowhere? Or is this a resource issue, or is it something else, I guess?
No, I think it's absolutely not a resource issue. If there's any body or group of bodies in Israel that are very well financed, very well resourced from every point of view, not just the money, but the personnel, they get first choice. Okay. Unit 8200, that type of unit, and the pilots, Air Force pilots, are the #1 picks today when new recruits join the IDF. Okay, they get first choice of the best people we have. Again, I think we've got, despite everything we're talking about, I think we have a remarkable intelligence community. Really smart people do some really dumb things sometimes, or display severe human frailties. So that this woman reached the chief of military intelligence. He happened to be a storied general, but personality-wise, probably should never have been appointed chief of military intelligence because he's a guy who knows everything. And that's great for a battlefield commander because you need a lot of self-confidence. Well, even then, but you need a lot of self-confidence to lead people in battle. you got to be a much more skeptical person, a questioning person when you're the head of intelligence. And you have to be open to lots and lots of different viewpoints. And even if you don't agree, well, what can I take from that? And maybe, all right, so 10% of it was right. And this is a guy who makes quick decisions. He knows what's happening. So I don't think this was resources. I think this is a matter of the concepts. We didn't get into that. There were certain, but going back to what I was saying before about you need certain operating assumptions just to be able to function on a day-to-day level. They were wrong. They got in the way. They blinded us. Instead of being what you use to facilitate the analytical process and to improve the analytical process, they blinded us to what was happening. That's something that I don't think there is any organizational fix for. That's the history of intelligence failures that we were talking about all over the world. I don't think there is a solution to intelligence failures. Now, we can talk about a couple of the possibilities. I don't think what we need is another layer of bureaucracy. I do think we need a couple of still organizational changes, but it doesn't require another level of bureaucracy. Now, there are some people, some smart people who disagree with me on that. They want an American type DNI, Director of National Intelligence. There are always going to be failures.
So the question comes down to when it comes to October 7th, I guess there are two views. The prime minister would like to say this was a big intelligence failure. He was never alerted. No member of his senior staff, he claims, and perhaps it's true, came to him and said Hamas is planning a big operation. He's very keen to blame others. Many Israelis and some of us abroad would say, no, this was fundamentally a political failure. And it was a political failure owing to the prime minister's wishful thinking about what Hamas, the threat that Hamas represented in the overall scale of problems for Israel. What is your view on that subject? Was this ultimately a political failure and ultimately his failure?
Well, I think there's a lot of blame to go around. The intelligence community failed abysmally. And it doesn't matter who the prime minister is. It's their job to present a correct assessment. And if they don't, they bear responsibility for that. And the IDF bears responsibility for not having been prepared for the intelligence failure. Now, the prime minister may be right that he wasn't told that Hamas is going to attack on October 7th. But he, just from the open source record, he had been informed repeatedly over the preceding half year that there were a lot of warning signs out there that something was happening. Now, there was the conception of which he was a primary architect. And one of the problems is that he partly, at least, forced this down upon the intelligence community. Not in the sense that, guy, this is it, you must take it, but in the sense that dissenting voices aren't really heard or they're discouraged. Then there's the fact, it became sort of the accepted wisdom that, oh yeah, we can continue ignoring the Palestinian issue by maintaining the separation between the West Bank and Gaza. And to that end, it's also good to keep Hamas in power and strengthen them even. Now, that was partly based on an assumption that the intelligence people accepted as well, which was that we seem to have partly tamed Hamas, not that they've given up on their fundamental character or fundamental objectives, but at least for the meantime, they want to focus on domestic issues on the economy. So he bears blame, I think, for at least partly forcing this approach on the intelligence system. Then there's the judicial overhaul, which people may no longer remember. It's been a year, but for the previous, what was it, about nine months, Israel was tearing itself apart at the seams. The IDF and the intelligence community were coming apart, literally coming apart. People were afraid of civil war, were afraid of units not showing up for duty. The military brass, the chiefs of intelligence, were simply devoting well, it would have been disproportionate in any event, but a grossly disproportionate amount of their time to simply trying to prevent the IDF, the Air Force, from coming apart. The commander of the Air Force is constantly having to meet with pilots, primarily reserve pilots, to say, do not refuse to show up for duty. We need you. Now, it's not as if these guys didn't know it. They thought that they were trying to answer to a higher good here. This came out. I'm not saying anything in this call that isn't open source. The Mossad gave its employees special permission to participate in the anti-government demonstrations because normally civil servants aren't allowed to. Now, they did that not as a political act, but because otherwise half the agency might have resigned. And the brass and the intelligence chiefs repeatedly said to Netanyahu, this is tearing us apart. And by the way, it's encouraging our enemies who think that they can take advantage of this to attack us. And you didn't have to be an intelligence chief. I wrote it in numerous places. I don't remember if that was one of the things that you wrote as well. But I mean, it was clear to everyone. So I think he bears great responsibility for the conception and for the judicial overhaul.
Let's talk about now. Let's move forward and look at the range of threats and questions of analysis that bear on Israel's security. And the first one that's on my mind is the North, is the Hezbollah. You've been in this business for a long time, thinking about it for a long time. Is this a question of when, but not if, that Israel will soon find itself in a major war in the North? Are there things that we should be thinking about that maybe aren't out there yet? I mean, what are you thinking about when you look to the North?
Well, I'm looking with great concern, because if Hamas turned out to be an infinitely greater threat than we thought, well, we know Hezbollah is a huge threat. Again, if Hamas had something like 30,000 rockets when the war broke out, Hezbollah's got something like 150,000, including long-range ones. It's a small percentage of the arsenal of the 150, but even 10,000 is a lot. That can hit Tel Aviv and way below. Most of them are up to Haifa, but Haifa is a big city in Israel as well. And what makes it particularly dangerous is that in recent years, they've developed a precision arsenal, meaning that they don't just aim it at Tel Aviv, but you can target something very specific down to a yard or so. And what this means is that for the first time in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, there's an Arab force that will have the ability to do a number of things. First of all, to disrupt mobilization processes, to hit the mobilization centers and the arms warehouses. They will be able to hit Israel's most important military capabilities, first and foremost air bases, and try and put them out of operation, even if briefly that would have a huge impact on Israel's warfighting capabilities. They will be able to hit civilian infrastructure, which also serves the army, by the way, but whether it's the major electric generating plants, whether it's the water system, whether it's the communication systems. Imagine trying to run a modern country and the IDF when there are no computers available, when there are no cell phones available. If just, let's say, to take a mundane example, if they just knock out the traffic light system because electricity's out, all of Israel becomes one traffic snarl in a matter of minutes. Guys can't reach the front. The war can be over.
So listening to you.
And just one other point, just to add to the joy, they can also hit command and control, whether it's the prime minister down to the tactical communications nodes. So this is a totally different war, and they can also overwhelm the defensive systems, Iron Dome, etc.
So is this a war Israel could lose?
I don't think we'll lose, but I don't think there'll be any, or I'm confident we won't lose, but I don't think there'll be any victors. The Israeli home front, I talked about the strategic targets that will be hit, but to slightly overstate the case, and only slightly, there won't be an apartment building in Israel that won't be hit in the course of this war. Lebanon will be totally devastated, not just Hezbollah, but Lebanon. And the good news here, to the extent that there is any, is that the Lebanese public knows this. They're still angry at Hezbollah for starting the 2006 war, which led to Lebanon being hit extremely hard. And they know that this time it's a multiple of that. So that's been the restraining factor, the deterring factor for Hezbollah. But the fact that Lebanon will be devastated is of very little comfort to us.
At least since 2006, Israeli military and intelligence planners have been thinking about what this war will be like, I think, and are you confident that the sophistication of the thinking is adequate to the scale of the threat? Is this something that Israelis have a better grasp on, Israeli intelligence and military planners, than they did when it came to October 7th, which was deadly in part because it was so very crude?
Well, I think one of the dangers here is maybe we're overestimating the threat and conducting some self-deterrence in this case. I at least don't think that we're underestimating it. I think everyone is aware, everyone certainly in the defense and intelligence system are aware of the magnitude of the threat. And as you're saying, everybody's been thinking about it since 2006. Is there a solution? No. Think of it this way. Let's say we launch an all-out operation. Since they've got the long-range rockets, if you really want to do something effective, you have to push them all the way to the northern border of Lebanon with Syria. It's not like the not so good old days when if you push them back to the Litani River, you solve the problem. Today you would solve a large part of it, but not all of it. I think you asked, is it an if or when? I tend to think that it's a when. And despite being the guy who's normally known to advocate the moderate solutions and the diplomatic solutions, which I'm in favor of trying now, I think the only question is the when we have to do it.
And is sooner better than later? Is the metaphor here, or the analogy, cancer? The sooner you operate, the likelier the chance of survival? Or does Israel need to recover its strength in order to have an effective operation?
So I'll answer you on a couple of levels, and including a personal story, an anecdote. Remind me the first part of the question.
Well, is sooner better than later is the question.
Right. In normal circumstances, I would say sooner, but we're not in normal circumstances. We had the devastating impact of October 7th, and Israel is still reeling from it, and the IDF is very overstretched, not to say exhausted after 9 months. Remember, most of the IDF are reservists, and there are a lot of guys who have done 6 months and more of duty since then, and they've got families and they've got businesses that have been ruined, and they're students in university, and they want to get back to their lives, and they've got really pressing issues to deal with. And despite what I believe remarkable response by President Biden, there are still limitations on weapons stores, and the IDF could use some more time to prepare, even though it is ready. It's used the time to make itself ready. I think the biggest problem is Israel's international standing and primarily the relations with the U.S. I thought that we were heading to a crisis with the U.S. long before the war broke out, And I think the war temporarily postponed it, but intensified it. While Biden was there, I had no fundamental concerns. I think he would have put a lid on things. Trump, I think, is totally unforeseeable how he'll handle things. And Harris is as yet untested on Israel with some reason for concern.
Let me, I want to try to think a little imaginatively about future crises, but one aspect that has come up in the recent days is that there's been talk of the Russians supplying the Houthis with the kinds of missiles that could really threaten shipping in the region and presumably also threaten Israel. And the threat picture is not just Hamas or Hezbollah or even Iran. It is Iran as the patron of these powerful proxy groups, and Iran also as the ally of Russia and China, a kind of a new sort of Axis powers in world affairs. And how does that possibility that Russia could, for example, arm the Iranians with increasingly sophisticated weaponry as a thank you note for the drones that Iran has provided the Russians, how does that change Israel's strategic equation? I mean, what does an Israeli military planner do looking at that broader geopolitical picture?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. It's not just Hamas. It's not just Hezbollah. It's the Houthis. It's various Iranian-affiliated militias in Iraq and Syria, and it's Iran itself. And Iran seems to believe that this axis of resistance, as they call it, has not only succeeded in, let's say, equaling or forestalling what was heretofore Israel's overwhelming strategic or overwhelming conventional superiority, but maybe even gaining superiority over us. Now, whether they're right or wrong, and I tend to think that they're wrong, if they believe that, and they seem to believe that today, then that has a big impact on how they operate and their willingness to take risks. Now, one of the things that they will undoubtedly want is to get a payback from Russia. They will want very advanced weapons in exchange for the drones that they provided in Russia's hour of need. And I think the Russians will do it. We'll probably see the latest Sukhoi fighters, their equivalent of the American F-35. We will see maybe the SA-4, their most advanced anti-missile system. We will see other things. And they may have already supplied things that we don't know about. And another area where Russia can cause us a great deal of trouble is in the nuclear issue, if and when talks ever get going again. And I think there's only a diplomatic resolution here. A military option can buy time, but it won't solve the issue. The Russians can play a very negative role there. In the past, they played a semi-decent one. And what the impact, the direct impact that this has already had on Israeli policy, people criticize Israel for not fully joining the US in support of Ukraine when the war broke out. And I don't think they realized the really, really deep set of concerns that Israel has when it comes to the Russian role in the region. It's everything I was just saying now. But if they deploy the, it's not SA-4, the SA.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. It's a surface to air missile. Their equivalent of Patriot.
Their most advanced system. I'm using the wrong term, but it's their most advanced system. It is extremely effective.
The S-400, I believe.
The S-400, right? Exactly, the S-400. They withdrew the one that they had from Syria when the war broke out in Ukraine. They can redeploy it. They can give it to move it into Syrian hands, Iranian hands, right in Syria. One of the reasons that Israel did not want to come out against Russia when the war first broke out in Ukraine was because we were scared stiff that they could shut down Israeli airspace. that we could no longer operate over Syrian territory to try and attack the Iranian buildup in Syria. So yeah, of course, Russia has a big impact on Israeli thinking. And China has yet to become a significant military player in the region, but it could. And they also have a very close relation with the Iranians.
Well, we like to keep things as depressing as possible at SAPIR. So with that, on that note, I'm going to turn to the questions of the participants on this call. The last question I see is, do you sleep at night? That's maybe we'll hold off on that. Paul Ross wants to know, does Israel have the capability of unleashing a strike on Iran of the magnitude that would cause Iran to change its strategy or tactics?
Well, the question is whether we're talking about something that could put an end to the nuclear program, or are we talking something which is not directed against the nuclear program? I think the day when the nuclear program could have been taken out militarily is behind us. Even the US can't destroy it completely, because even if it does, the Iranians have the know-how and can reconstitute it in relatively short terms, maybe a couple of years, 3 years. Israel probably can't, or may not even be able to do that anymore. They've dug it so deep in below a mountain and in a new underground fortress that they've built. Maybe only American. There's the massive bunker buster, what some call the mother of all bombs, which is maybe the only thing that can do it. Can Israel hit Iran in ways that might create some deterrence, some at least hesitation on their part? I think yes. And my own view is that we have to start doing that. Until now, what we've done is maybe played their game in the sense that we've tried to restrict the battlefield to their proxies. The Hamas, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, we could go the Houthis, and they don't pay much of a price for that, or any price. Now, of course, the problem with hitting them directly is, are you starting a much bigger war? And a war with Iran will, since it will bring all of the proxies in, will be even worse than the war just against Hezbollah that I was talking about. And Iran itself, today, if until 4 or 5 years ago, Iran had a very, very limited ability to hit us directly from their own territory, massively by Hezbollah, but not from their own territory. Today, they've got quite a significant capability to hit us from their own territory. And the UAV threat has become problematic because we don't have good defenses against that yet. We probably will in a few years, but not yet.
Let me turn to another question here, which is from Fern Levitt, who asks, when Israel knew about the tunnels in Gaza and knew about the purpose of the tunnels, why was no action taken?
Well, we knew that there were tunnels, and we destroyed some of them over the years. It's not that anyone was blind to the fact that they were digging tunnels. No one had the vaguest idea that it was anything on the order of magnitude that it turned out to be, literally a few hundred miles.
But let me ask you that, let me follow up there. How is that possible? I mean, how is it that Israel, that has, so much human intelligence as well, how could they have failed to know that it wasn't just, a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen tunnels aimed at small commando operations under the border, but this entire fortress in Gaza? I mean, one had heard that these tunnels existed, but how does an intelligence agency like Israel, capable of stealing all of Iran's nuclear secrets overnight, how do they fail to see what's on their practically their front door?
That's one of the things that the Commission of Inquiry, if and when it's established, will have to find out. It's mind-boggling. And just to give one simple example, I mean, what did they do with all the dirt that they dug out? Where did it go? How did we miss this?
I think your expression, says it all. Gary Applebaum wants to know, does Israel have adequate intelligence to know when Iran is close to having a functional nuclear weapon? And he says weapon, not just quantities of enriched uranium.
Well, I mean, they're already a threshold nuclear state, meaning that they can break out in short order. They're still thought to need maybe a year and a half, 2 years to go from just having all the necessary highly enriched uranium, which they have today, to an actual weapon. Will we be able to know about that in time? Not sure. It's something that can be done in small facilities. It's not like the uranium enrichment, which has to be done in big factories, big plants. So Iran seems to be extremely penetrated by Israeli and American and Western intelligence, but you never know what you don't know.
Phil Siegel asks a question. He points to the failure of public health to prepare for COVID, of airlines to prepare for the CrowdStrike fiasco here in the United States, wildfires, Europe not prepared for the invasion of Ukraine, and notes that it's a crisis of management preparedness in preparedness systems in democracy. So is the real problem here, in effect, the nature of democratic governance and the way in which democratic leaders will always prioritize popular measures over necessary ones, or obvious threats against sort of black swan type events?
Well, I think that is in the nature of the beast. People don't like to deal with threats before they have no choice. They're costly, they divert attention from other priorities. But I wouldn't berate democracies too much, because I don't see that Putin has made such great decisions, and Xi seems to have made some rather poor ones in China as well, and not all of the decisions by the supreme leader in Iran have been that brilliant. So these are problems that we all face, and these democracies have corrective mechanisms that the non-democracies do not.
Abigail Gurevsky raises the question of the West Bank. And, prior to October 7th, Israeli military planners, officials were very worried about the situation in the West Bank. Much of the Israeli army was deployed there for the fear of another intifada. Do you think that we could see an eruption in the West Bank as things seem to be cooling down in Gaza? What's your assessment?
Well, the remarkable thing is that the West Bank has remained relatively quiescent since the war broke out. There have been enough attacks, but...
Has that surprised you?
Yes.
And why do you think it is?
I don't have a good explanation. I think maybe when the war first broke out, they were as thunderstruck as everyone else. Look at what happened there just a couple of years ago, when over not very major incidents on the Temple Mount, the whole West Bank was inflamed, and it led to the previous round with Hamas. I don't know why it hasn't happened this time.
Do you think the scale of destruction in Gaza has had a chastening effect on Palestinians who might be tempted to start another intifada?
Well, by now, I'm sure for many people, the answer is yes, but that doesn't explain why they didn't get involved in the beginning. The young people who no longer remember the second intifada, I think, and since they're removed from Gaza, I think many of them are chomping at the bit and they're waiting for an opportunity. It's going to be an ongoing problem no matter what happens. If miraculously there's peace tomorrow, we could have ongoing terror threats from the West Bank, and that's not going to happen. So we'll continue to face the problem for a long time.
Do you see any possibility of something like an Arab mandate for Palestinian area territories, at least starting with Gaza? What role do you see for the so-called Abraham Accord states to assume security responsibilities, reconstruction responsibilities once there's some kind of quasi-resolution in Gaza?
I think their willingness and ability to really play a constructive security role is limited. They can certainly help greatly on physical reconstruction. They can finance that. They can help facilitate it in other ways. They can hold the hands and provide political cover for whoever the next governing body is. But the real problem is if Israel is to get out of Gaza, and God forbid that we don't at some point in the not distant future, who takes over? Who is in charge? Now, there are, to my way of thinking, only a very small number of possibilities that are realistic. One is that Hamas takes over again, and what did we go to war for? Another is that we get stuck there for the long term. We're already in charge of 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. Do we really want to be in control again of another 2 million in Gaza? I don't think so. Palestinian Authority is the likely candidate, but they don't really have the capabilities. So some sort of reformed Palestinian Authority. Who's going to come in and provide the security if it isn't Israel? Okay, the entire IDF is I am overstating the case. A very large percentage of the IDF was deployed there at the height of the war, and there are still significant forces. What country in the world, in the international arena or in the Mideast, is going to send forces into harm's way? International peacekeeping forces are effective when the sides want peace and they just need somebody to help police it. Here, that's not the case. So I don't think, despite the recent reports about the UAE being willing to do something, maybe they'll send a few soldiers. Where's the fighting unit here? I don't see it. And so, since I hope we won't have to be there for the very long term, I think there's no alternative but to rebuild the PA, or to work with them.
Well, this brings me to Irma Freilich's question, which is when Abbas dies, the PLO is vulnerable to Hamas leadership. They're provoking Israel now with small attacks. This is going to be another surprise to Israel if they don't act proactively in Judea and Samaria now and be prepared for that change of regime. Abbas, I believe, is 86 or 87 years old. Surely there's going to be some change fairly soon. What do you foresee there?
First of all, the answer is nobody knows. And there are various estimates of who might try to take over. And one possibility is that there's a bloodbath among the competing leaders. Another very likely possibility is that Hamas takes over. Another possibility is complete chaos. It would be nice to think that there will be an orderly process of succession. I don't think there's a lot of reason for optimism on that. And so the West Bank may in the coming years really become a very hot front, and not the relatively quiet one, not so quiet, but relatively so, of recent years. One of the possibilities, by the way, if there is a real hostage exchange, then the Hamas will demand the release of Marwan Barghouti, who has been convicted of the killing of 6 Israelis in a life sentence. Some people compare him, I think, unjustly to Mandela. He's not the Palestinian Mandela, but he does have great popularity in the Palestinian community. Maybe he gets released and he becomes the leader.
And is that better than the plausible alternatives, or worse in your view?
It's hard to say. I mean, the pre-jail Barghouti is someone we might have been able to work with despite his bad traits. He's now been in jail for, over 20 years. Yeah, I don't know where he really stands today. But pretty much anything is better than Hamas.
Let me ask you, so Martin Crozel of Toronto asks, there's an elephant in the chat room. October 7th was a black swan, which is very hard to predict. that, to my mind, leaves reason to give Israeli intelligence the benefit of the doubt. On the other hand, Israel has not been militarily hit from three of the territories: Gaza, southern Lebanon, and the West Bank. Isn't it time that that the people who still have who still favor the peace option be held accountable for their folly? Do you have an answer for Martin?
I do. And that is that I think that both the left and the right in Israel have been proven very wrong in their assumptions. The left was by far overly enamored of the peace process, and the right has no answer to the demographic issue. And so I think we all have to rethink our views, whatever they were, and try and come up with some new solutions that ensure Israel's future as a secure Jewish and democratic state.
So with 3 minutes to go, Chuck, I thought we were at the most depressing point possible at the end of our 40 minutes, but now we've sunk even further, and I only mean that as a compliment. What, if anything, gives you, as someone who's been in the thick of these strategic questions for a whole lifetime, gives you any optimism? Why continue to live if you're a Jew in Israel, if the strategic picture looks so as bleak as you seem to have just described it?
It's always been bleak. For as long as Israel's been around, certainly pre-state days, it's always been bleak. In the first few decades, we thought that and I think correctly, that we faced a real existential threat. I don't think we have actually since the peace with Egypt, but certainly in recent decades. And unless Iran goes nuclear, I don't think we will face existential threats. I'm differentiating existential from severe. Hezbollah, Hamas have become severe threats, but they're not existential. I'm old enough to remember the Yom Kippur War vividly, when there was fear for Israel's very existence. And our population, the Jewish population, was about 3 million at the time, and we lost almost 3,000 guys. And, well, October 7th started with an incredible screw-up, 1,200 people on that one day, but we've lost 350-something guys since then, which is out of a Jewish population of 7.5 million. Israel, I believe, is a very, very strong country. We remain a regional power, a major regional power, maybe the strongest country in the region. We still have a extraordinary and very dynamic economy, which is now going to go through a tough period, but it'll rebound. The people of Israel are phenomenally resilient and phenomenally creative and innovative. And I think we're going to have a very good future. Yeah, we're going through a miserable period. Yet, it'll be okay.
Well, on that hopeful, prayerful note, I want to thank you, Chuck. You wrote an extraordinary essay for us. The whole issue, if I may say, is extraordinary. There's a lot of good stuff in here, as there is in every issue of SAPIR. But the best part about SAPIR is our relationship with our audiences and our effort to maintain a Jewish conversation and to provide ideas for a thriving Jewish future. That is what this magazine is about. We will continue to do this. You are, Chuck, one of many distinguished people we've had in these conversations, from American politicians like Richie Torres, Noah Tishby, just not so long ago, Lionel Shriver, the great novelist. We have these on a regular basis, and we rely on our audience for your questions and your interest and your sustained support. So thank you so much for being part of this. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week.
Thanks, and thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Chuck.